Hi, and welcome to Responsa Radio, where you ask and we answer questions of Jewish law in modern times. I'm Rabbi Avi Killip, Executive Vice President at Hadar, here with Rabbi Ethan Tucker, Rosh Yeshiva at Hadar, a center for Jewish learning and community building based in New York City. You can check us out and learn more at hadar.org. Sometimes we get questions from people who are just exploring more observance, right? They're on their way sort of into deeper engagement with Torah and mitzvot. And that can come with all sorts of beautiful surprises and rituals that you get to be a part of that you never knew existed before in your Judaism. But one of the things that you may discover as you develop more observance or you move more into communities that are observing halakha is something called a minor fast day.
That name already has it in for it.
I know. First of all, it's a fast day, and second of all, it's minor. So it has a double whammy, right? So the question that we have today comes from that place.
Okay, great.
The questioner writes, I grew up fasting on Yom Kippur and usually on Tisha B'Av also. I never even knew about the minor fast days. Now I am in a community that does observe them, and I'm curious about their importance. Is my obligation to fast on these days the same as on Yom Kippur? Why is there so much variety in how they are observed by people who are otherwise observant? So maybe you'll start with just like a quick introduction of what is a minor fast day? What are these holidays? How often do they occur? Give us a little bit of a primer, and then we can dive in more to why would people observe them differently.
Yeah. I'll say what's so interesting about this whole category is most Jewish holidays, dates on the calendar, are either about something seasonal or they are about some historical event that we are marking. And what we'll get to talk about is what's fascinating about these days is they are not only about events in the Jewish past, they are about responding to the waves of history, and in some ways, even what the Jewish present is like has something to say about what these days are like. You can find these fasts already in the Bible, in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah is one of the prophets that is a prophet of return. So the Babylonian exile has already happened, but then people are beginning to return, and he's prophesying about the rebuilding of the temple, and he's actually in that period where it's beginning to happen. And he refers to 4 dates: the fast of the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th months. On our calendar, those are fasts falling in the months of Tammuz, Av, Tishrei, and Tevet. Those 4 fasts, not given specific days of the month, but in those months, map onto the 4 fast days that we know of today that are in this package, which are Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, Tzom Gedalia, the 3rd of Tishrei, the fast of Gedalia, and Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet.
Yeah.
So they're there. Here's the interesting intro of how we get introduced to them. In the book of Zechariah, as I mentioned, they're returning. They're rebuilding the temple. And there's one scene in the book of Zechariah where the temple has already begun to be rebuilt, and people from the community come and they say, hey, should we still observe all these fast days? And what you get as a picture there is, oh, these fast days were some kind of historical response to the destruction of the first temple. And indeed, that's the narrative we've preserved about these. If I were to tell it in historical order, the 10th of Tevet is the day on which the city was besieged. Jerusalem was besieged. On the 17th of Tammuz, the walls were finally breached. On the 9th of Av, the temple was burned and destroyed. And then on the 3rd of Tishrei, Gedalia, who was appointed as the governor of Judea and was like a last remnant of any kind of Jewish autonomy, is assassinated actually by a fellow Jew. and the last bit of any Jewish independence falls apart.
So they mark 4 different events, but they're not really independent. They're really stages in a demise.
That's right. You sort of begin at the 10th of Tevet, go all the way to the 3rd of Tishrei, and it's a cycle of marking the demise of what we would call the first commonwealth, as it were. And the people reasonably come to Zechariah and they're like, hey, we're kind of back now.
Yeah.
We've got a temple. Maybe these fast days are obsolete now. Zechariah gives them an incredible answer, which is mainly incredible because it's totally unclear what it means. He essentially says, in the name of God, do you think I ever cared about your stupid fast days? What I need you to do is to build a just society that will be worthy of my favor, remaining on this earth, not subject to a next destruction. And essentially, I don't really care that much about your fast day. And indeed, in the future, these 4 fast days will not be fast days, but they will be days of sason and simcha, days of celebration and rejoicing. So is he telling them to fast? Is he telling them not to fast? That part seems deliberately cryptic, but he does seem to be saying the fast day is not the main point. The point is something about the arc of history that you're going to walk from this moment through to some messianic, non-messianic future where these days that you have observed as fast days become celebratory. But that also seems that that's not right now for him.
Yeah. It's funny. My first thought was going to be like, oh, so some people observe these, some people don't. God's in the don't category. God's like, oh, fast days? No, I'm not into that.
You get some different data points here, different scattered texts. Some people seem like they're trying to abolish these days. You know, you have stories, it seems like Rabbi, the great sage, is like bathing on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz in a public way, which seems like it was against the norms of what was going on. Even a source that says he tried to uproot the 9th of Av. A later source is like, no way, how could he have done that? It must have been a more controlled experiment.
And the reasoning here is presumably because he's got a new temple. He's saying we no longer need to mourn the first one.
Well, the interesting thing is Rabbi lives after the destruction of the second temple.
Right.
And so he seems to almost be playing with the idea of, I don't know, actually things with the Romans right now are not half bad. By the time you get to Rabbi,
Rabbi's like, I don't like the way that Judaism's become all about victimhood.
Well, there is an aspect, I think some people have read that in. You have a different statement in the name of Shmuel, one of the early Babylonian sages. He says, in Bavel, the only public fast, whatever that term exactly means, the only public fast, the only Ta'anit Tzibur is the 9th of Av. Mm-hmm. Does that mean the others aren't observed at all? Or does it mean something like how we treat it today, which is, well, public fast means you observe it for 25 hours. You don't wear shoes. You don't bathe, all the stuff with Tisha B'Av. A minor fast, which is not a rabbinic terminology, but the way people often refer to it today, the other fasts are still on the calendar, but you observe them from dawn to nightfall. You wear shoes, you can bathe, you can do all those things. It's just less of a big deal.
I'm curious to ask, you didn't mention Tanit Esther, the fast of Esther, and you also, I don't know, maybe the fast of the firstborn that happens before the Seder. If you want to just give us a sentence or two about, are those the same category? Are these different fasts?
Yeah, they're not the same category. It's actually really helpful to hold them up as a contrast. Those are not about the current state of Jewish history. Those are about events in the past. It's about reenacting the drama of Esther fasting before deliverance. It's just sort of act one of the Purim story. Similarly, the fast of the firstborn, That's a prelude to going into the Seder night when the firstborn are going to be smitten and you're figuring out, right, what's going to be, and you're on eggshells. Those fasts are medieval. They're later. They're not in the Bible. They're not even mentioned in the Talmud. So they'll be dealt with more leniently on other axes, whether having a siyum to get out of them or much more leniency around people who might get a headache or not feel well when it comes to Ta'anit Aster. But the barometer of whether you're doing them or not is not what's the current state of affairs.
Yeah.
So there's clearly some degree of unevenness around this. The Yerushalmi even says in one point, in a way that evokes the questioner, it'll say, why isn't Shiva Asar B'Tammuz sort of fixed as a fast day? Because most people didn't agree to do it. Mm-hmm. and then they interrogate further and they say, well, why? And Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, you know why? Because one thing after another happened on Tisha B'Av. The first and second temple were destroyed on that same day. Whereas Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, none of the bad things that happened on it ever happened a second time.
Interesting.
So it became this historical memory, and a lot of people just didn't do it in a way that Tisha B'Av became, that's the day where we focus on our repeating tragedy. There's an interesting Mishnah that says, lists all the months when they would send out messengers to make sure everyone in the Jewish world knew when Rosh Chodesh had been. To make sure they knew, this is when this month began, so you have all the exact dates and all the things you would expect. You send it out in Nisan to make sure people know when Pesach is. You send it out in Elul so people will know when Rosh Hashanah is. You have to
send the quarterly shul bulletin, or else nobody will know when the next quarter's holidays will be.
Love it. So great, you have all those things. And it says, and you send them out in Av, so people will know when the fast is. Mm-hmm. So the Talmud says, you didn't mention Tevet and Tammuz.
Yeah.
Why don't people need to know when those begin so that they can observe those fasts on the right day? And the answer is basically the following. Look at the book of Zechariah. He calls them a fast day, but then he also says they'll be of rejoicing. How can they be both a fast day and a day of rejoicing? Like, when do they make that transition? How does that happen? And the answer, essentially, that emerges at the end is, well, that's because their status depends on context. What's going on right now in history will tell you what's happening. And here's the categories. If it's a time of shalom, we'll leave that undefined right now. It obviously means peace. But if it's a time of shalom, then these are days of rejoicing, meaning you're not allowed to fast on them.
So the better things are, or maybe if things are, this is something positive, right?
Something's good.
Then
maybe it has
joyous.
To be great. Maybe it has to be messianic. We don't know yet. But like peace, shalom, leads you to rejoicing. Don't observe them as a fast day. Mm-hmm. If it's a time of shmad, a time of persecution, then these are full-on fast days, no different from any other. If it's not shmad and not shalom, is that most of history? I don't know. If it's neither persecution nor whatever we mean by shalom.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
Yeah,
it was something in between.
It was neither the best nor the worst of times. Then here's the language. Ratzu mitanin, ratzu ein mitanin. If they want to, they fast. If they don't want to, they don't fast. Now the term there, ratzu, is a little tricky, like who has to want to?
Like if your rabbi wants you to, or if you want to.
Yeah, so some people later read this term as, actually no, it means each individual. Like the Geonim assume this means each individual can decide whether they're doing it. Others read it as more of like a communal decision, whether it's the rabbi or the community, or some other way that it's not just up to the individual. But one way or the other, the Talmud does claim normatively, it is not fully obligatory. It's an optional fast that someone or some group has to make a decision to observe. And they just note, well, wait a minute, does that mean Tisha B'Av is also optional if it's during a time that's in the middle? And they'll say, no. Tisha B'Av is different because so many horrible things happened on it, one after the other. So the plainest reading of the Gemara, though there's some debate about this, is that remains obligatory for all time. So as you can imagine, it becomes pretty critical to define what's shalom and what's shmad. How do we define what counts in historical context as peace and what counts as persecution? Because that's really going to determine, right, where
practice.
We are in terms of the practice. Now, again, the Talmud does seem to take for granted that the period in the time of the Mishnah is one that was neither shalom nor shmad. It was neither peace nor persecution. That's why the fast days were not triggering sending out the emissaries to know when Tevet and Tammuz started. Like the only sense in which it makes...
because it's optional. We're an optional.
Yeah, if it were obligatory, you would have to send out the emissaries. So it does seem like, to the extent the Mishnah extends, which it seems it does, into a post-destruction moment, right? The fact that there's no temple doesn't mean that it's an obligatory fast. That's not a time of persecution.
Right.
And then the question is, people sitting later on in history, in the Middle Ages, in the modern period. So how do they view and assess their own time vis-a-vis that picture that the Mishnah gives? I just want to give you one story, which we get from the Middle Ages, which gives you a sense of, both an approach and a ruling. So as background, the normal assumption is a woman who has just given birth is essentially not expected to fast for the first week postpartum. But starting on day 8, she's basically by default in the category of those who are expected to fast on Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'Av, on any fast day. Of course, for our listeners, that always depends on medical condition and this and that. But I'm just giving you as a context of, the assumption is by day 8, we'll assess you like anyone else who might have a medical condition, but it's not an automatic exemption. So there is a woman who has just given birth, and her 8th postpartum day falls out on Tzom Gedalia, on the 3rd day of Tishrei. Okay? And she comes to Rabbeinu Tam and says, do I need to fast? Right? Like it's a fast day tomorrow. If it were, she basically knows, if it were Yom Kippur, I would fast.
Right.
She's going to fast basically in a week from then. Do I have to fast today? And his answer is, well, look, Tzom Gedalia is in the Bible and it's a real fast day and things that are even in the prophets are like they're in the Torah. But the Talmud did say that when it's neither a time of persecution nor a time of peace, these days are optional.
He's like, well, it is a choose-your-own-adventure holiday.
And since they're optional, even though everyone else clearly in the community, and her by default is like, well, we fast, but Rabbeinu Tam's like, yeah, but they fast just as an exercising of an option.
Right.
And actually, you don't have to. In a week, you'll have to fast on Yom Kippur. If you were asking me about Tisha B'Av, I'd also tell you have to fast because that one isn't an optional one. Right. But these 3 are optional. So there you see, I think, 2 interesting things. One, Rabbeinu Tam, applying the precedent from the Talmud straight up and just saying, yeah, it's optional. But the other thing that's interesting is we often look back, we're like, oh, Rabbeinu Tam, he lived in like a terrible time of Jewish history. There were crusades, not so before his time. But he looks out and he's like, no, it's not great now, but like, it's not terrible.
Yeah.
So it's optional. That was actually a way a whole bunch of communities handled it.
This is a good time to take a quick break. We'll get right back to the episode, but first, I want to let you know about an upcoming program at Hadar that you will love, the July Learning Seminar in New York City. This is a week of incredible immersive learning, led by Hadar's stellar faculty and designed for learners of all backgrounds and all levels of text experience. Come connect, with an incredible network of people working together to build more meaningful Jewish lives. Visit hadar.org for more information. Now let's dive back in.
The Ramban comes along in Spain, number of generations after, and starts to weigh in on the question of how do we think about shalom and how do we think about shmad? He says shmad means there's Jews being persecuted somewhere. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's an objective standard of Jews are being persecuted somewhere, even if your community is fine.
Yeah.
There's sort of one decision the Jewish world makes about this. And he then makes two arguments. He says, I'm pretty sure that we can classify the experience of some Jews in contemporary Spain. He famously has to get into this disputation and then has to run away. There's some persecution going on here.
Yeah.
But he also adds and says, yeah, but what happened now, by the time you're asking me in the 13th century, the Jews have already accepted these fast days upon themselves as a sort of transgenerational requirement. Ratzu mitanin, if they want to, they can fast. He's like, not only is it they wanted to, they wanted us to, right? They wanted their descendants to. Mm-hmm. They basically took it on. And the Ramban tries to argue for, actually, there's no pathway back anymore to these days being optional.
Well, if any Jew anywhere is suffering is both like a beautiful and important thing for us to remember and live into, and also like a very particular way of saying what peoplehood means. Like, is the definition of peoplehood that if somebody's suffering, we all have to fast? Or is there some if somebody's joyous, we all have to be joyous? That's not what we have here presented.
That's right. The Ramban really shuts the door on conversation on this, essentially for hundreds of years until the founding of the State of Israel and the return of Jewish independence. That is to say, I can't tell you how many people are fasting on Tzom Gedalia or Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, but essentially, whereas Rabbeinu Tam is encouraging that postpartum woman to eat, the Ramban ushers in centuries of what you'll find in all the codes of, there was this interesting theoretical thing where some people used to think these are optional, but we don't think that anymore. And anyone who breaks with protocol around this is really violating communal norms. Mm-hmm. And these are fast days. They should be observed by anyone who cares about mitzvot as fast days.
Yeah, and that's sort of the normative take now?
That's the normative take, I would say, by default of most people in the discourse of mitzvot and halacha. Though our questioner is correctly describing, there are many people who are Shomrei Shabbat who don't fast on the 17th of Tammuz. Putting aside the question of how much rabbinic backing do they have for that, that is for sure true today. And there, I think, there is a part of the story that we have to sort of, tell the next part of, which does have some, rabbinic reflection and backing, but goes back to this question of shalom. All right. So we talked about the Ramban is saying shmad, persecution, Jews anywhere. Ratzu, at some point, some generation said we're taking this on for all time. But what about in the other direction? Rashi, when he defines the term shalom on the Talmudic passage we talked about, says, like when the Beit HaMikdash has been rebuilt. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it seems like the Ramban probably had that interpretation as well. In which case, if you're interpreting the Beit HaMikdash as literally the temple has to stand on the Temple Mount, so we live in the same era of history.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that a plurality of the Jewish people now lives in the land of Israel. It doesn't matter that there's a Jewish army, independence, all of that. There's no temple, so it's the same era. But the Rashba says, no, what does shalom mean? It means the Jewish people living on their land. Bisman sheYisrael shruyin al admatan. As long as the fundamental majority position of the Jews is not exile or dispersion, but most of them live in the land of Israel, then you're in the period of shalom. The Meiri also gives a similar definition. He says the Jews are not under oppression. They don't live under a foreign power. So this is the important thing to sort of note and take seriously. For the Rashba and the Meiri, it is definitely forbidden to fast on the 17th of Tammuz today, because they don't think the temple is the marker of being in the world of shalom, because the Talmud laid out this three-part structure. If it's shmad, persecution, it's obligatory. If it's not shmad, but it's not shalom, it's in that middle optional.
If you define shalom,
however you define shalom, it's sason v'simcha.
Right.
It's a celebration day.
Celebration.
You must eat. You're actually supposed to throw a party. Yeah. Okay. So
this is going to make for some awkward shul observance suggestions.
If you take them seriously, that's the answer. There were some. There's a famous story of Ephraim Elimelech Urbach. He's a great scholar of Jewish studies, and he wasn't like a sort of rabbinic figure, but he was a great scholar that in the 6-Day War, after the 6-Day War, when Shiva Asar B'Tammuz came around, he and a bunch of people went to the Kotel and had a l'chaim, right? Because they were basically what are you talking about? We're on the other side of history. They weren't breaking Talmudic law in their mind. They were following Talmudic law and at least the interpretations of, let's say, the Rashba and the Meiri.
It's sort of an incredible thing to live through a moment of transition that you would say, I'm on the other side of an era.
It's very unusual.
Right.
There's nothing else on the calendar that's
that you have to look to the headlines of the paper in order to know how to observe the holiday is an unusual reality.
Right. You could be in the Warsaw Ghetto and Pesach is still Pesach. You're remembering, but we once were liberated. But here, it's the whole holiday potentially shifts. Now, that's pretty far to go, right? The Rashba and the Meiri, and to say, well, I'm going to follow them, and it's a feast day today. I think it's far to go for a couple reasons. One, the Ramban and other views seem to be on the other side, so there's sort of at least a doubt about
unanimous.
This. Also, I don't know. It feels like there's a lot of hubris to say, we live in a moment of shalom just by dint of being independent, just by dint of living on the land. I'm brought back to that prophecy of Zechariah, where he says, what I need you to focus on is building a model society, not figuring out whether you're going to eat today. And I feel confident enough, even with tremendous gratitude, to live in a moment of Jewish sovereignty, Jewish independence, Jewish return to the land of Israel. We're not yet at the model society level. Yeah. And to the extent the fast days are about catalyzing us to think about that and how we move forward, it's hard to me. It doesn't feel in keeping with the prophetic charge to say where we are right now is at that other extreme of history, of shalom.
Right.
But I will also say it just feels wrong to me to say that we are in the era of shmad, of persecution. It feels irresponsible to me in an age of wielding Jewish power in Israel. And even the Jewish diaspora experience in America, it feels like it's a complete negation of the fact that to live as an equal citizen in America is nothing like living under the czar.
Yeah.
Is nothing like living under any of the regimes that our ancestors lived under. That to me has to count at least to the level of restoring, if we can use that word, restoring these days to their optional character. And I just have a hard time believing even the Ramban, with his strong statement of we've accepted these upon ourselves, I just have a hard time. If the Ramban really were to live through the dual experience of the state of Israel and Jewish integration in America, he would say, this is the same era of history as Inquisition, pre-Inquisition Spain. That doesn't seem coherent to me.
Right, or to imagine that that things are are worse now than for the Jews of the Mishnah. That feels like a strange thing to say. And at the same time, as these fast days have come up, especially in the last year, I have felt an intuition to fast on them in a way that I didn't have as much of an instinct of like, well, maybe there's a Jew somewhere who's suffering. Whereas like knowing that we have hostages in tunnels makes the idea that I should fast for a day feel like much more intuitive to me.
100%. So I'm glad you brought us here, because that to me is the corollary of what it is to be historically sensitive, right? The same historical sensitivity that I feel on a macro level forces you to say, wait a minute, we don't live in the Ramban's world writ large structurally. There's got to be a sense in which moving to independence, return to the land, all of that minimally moves you structurally to that middle category. I have felt, and to those who have asked me, I have given this guidance, that in the context of the events of October 7th, being in an active war, I feel these fast days are obligatory during that period. I have not treated them as optional, even though normally I fast on these days, but I think of it as fundamentally electing to do something optional. I have not felt that way in the past year and a half. And, you know, whether giving guidance to my kids or whoever else, I've said what it means to take these seriously. The very aspect of these days that makes me emphasize to you in a normal year, you know, I think it might be a good idea for you to fast, but like really you should understand that I don't think it's obligatory. That same dynamic makes me say to you this year, you really got to be doing this. In a way, if you want the legitimacy of thinking of them as optional in the other years, you have to treat them as obligatory this year, because otherwise, what are you just seeking for the ability to eat? Right? Then you're back in violating, I think, Zechariah's piece, which is you're asking me if you can have lunch. That is not a question God is interested in. God is interested, I think, in these days as giving us a sense of, are we checking ourselves against the rhythms of Jewish history and the Jewish present? And how can these days help focus us on where we are and where we need to be going?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Maybe I'll offer one more frame that I think these fast days can offer us. I sort of learned this from the way that the Talmud presents the fast of Tisha B'Av and where it comes from, which is not like you should be sad and fast on Tisha B'Av, but it feels more like it's a check on expansive and unchecked grief, right? The people are like, oh, we'll never eat ever again. And they're sort of told like, you can channel that energy into one day. You know, we'll never build houses again. It's like, well, just leave one piece of your house unbuilt. There's sort of actually, it's unsustainable to live entirely grieving the temple all the time in every aspect of your life. Let's find the outlets for it. And that's where you can sort of like channel your grief of Jewish historical pain into the day of Tisha B'Av. I think for me also, I find it sometimes helpful to use these minor fast days as a way of saying like, if for those of us who can't sustain peoplehood pain all the time in every moment of every day, to say, here are some anchor moments in your year that you can set aside to fast and really take seriously. And maybe that will allow you to eat on the other days.
You know, another thing I think is just important to kind of throw into the response to the questioner who's asking, why do I see people who are otherwise observant not observing these fast days? And it's important to remember in light of some of the things we've explored here. Look, sometimes people just don't do something because they're not particularly careful about it. And it's, you know, it's an inconsistency and there's no great theory behind it. And we all have things that we're more or less consistent about with observance. But it is important to pay attention when people who make real structural decisions in their lives to like leave work early on a Friday afternoon and observe Shabbat and do all kinds of things that are not just like the conventional thing to do. And then there's an element of something that they're not doing. Whether or not they have a fully worked through theory of that, there may be a sense in which they're intuitively getting at a certain theory of the mitzvah or the practice that maybe we are able to give more specialized rabbinic language around. But to me, that's always an important lesson and message. You see people who are committed Jews doing or sometimes not doing something. You want to interrogate that. In the words of the tradition, we're not all prophets, but we're all descended from prophets, and we have a certain religious intuition that's worth noting and respecting. And so some of the people who are not fasting on these days, I think they are intuitively looking around at Jewish history in the current moment and feeling some of the impact of the Gemara's thinking without necessarily knowing the Gemara.
Thank you for the person who submitted the question. Maybe you got more than you bargained for in terms of what are these days. And I think you've given us a lot to think about as we move forward. And hopefully this podcast and these texts will be helpful to people as we figure out how to navigate our observance of these days and also our way of interacting with the world around us. Thanks.
Don't make any plans, that way they can't go wrong. Your life is full of minor chords, playing on repeat.
Have a halachic question you'd like answered on the show? Email us at responsaradio@hadar.org. Responsa Radio is a project of the Hadar Institute. Thanks to Chana Kupetz and Jeremy Tabick for producing this podcast, and to David Khabinsky for recording and editing this episode.
The world I used to know